This book is called Equality's Call: The Story of Voting Rights in America, written by Deborah Dyson, illustrated by Magdalena Mora. Equality's Call. Equality's Call: The Story of Voting Rights in America. In 1776, the founders of the United States of America declared that consent of the governed would be a key component of our country. The founders didn't always agree on everything, but they did all believe that the power of our government should come from the will of the people, and that citizens would express their choices by voting in elections. But at that time, only some people were allowed to vote. Citizenship, the legal status of being a member of a country, and the right to vote, sometimes called the franchise, political franchise, or suffrage, were not available to all. Do you know some people who were not allowed to vote? As our nation grew, our understanding of democracy and rights grew too. Many people stood up and spoke up about abolition, or the end of slavery, about citizenship, about enfranchisement, and about civil rights, or equal opportunity for all. They also worked to end voter suppression, or the practice of discouraging or preventing people from voting. They heard equality's call. Our founders declared, when our country began, that consent of the governed was part of the plan. What do they mean by the governed? Who are the governed? There we go. Nice and adjusted so you can see. Through voting, elections, and representation, the voice of the people would strengthen our nation. In fact, though, for years, this great founding ideal was extended to some, and for others, not real. Do you know who wasn't allowed to vote? But we heard in the distance equality's call. A right isn't right till it's granted to all. The states set the rules about who got to vote, and your gender, your race, and your wealth were of note. Who couldn't vote? Who do you see here? White men with property went to the polls, but the rest of the people were left off the rolls. The dream of democracy wasn't yet true. There were changes to make. There was still work to do. But we heard, growing clearer, equality's call. A right isn't right till it's granted to all. Do you notice more people are joining them? What are they joining them to do? The rules about wealth were the first thing to go. As more were enfranchised, meaning given they had the right to exercise the right to vote, therefore their voices could grow. And a small group of voices was raising the fact that enslavement was wrong, an unspeakable act. So slavery and voting rights are both being brought up on this page. Good people stood up for the truth that they knew. Abolition and suffrage were long overdue. Abolition, to end slavery. Suffrage, to extend voting rights to all people. We heard ever louder equality's call. A right isn't right till it's granted to all. I notice more and more people joining the line of people raising their voices in protest. There was war in our nation, and slavery ended. Amendments were added, the franchise extended. Now more men could vote, at least so the law said, yet denial through taxes and tests were widespread. People had to show that they paid taxes in order to vote. People even had to take tests in order to vote. And the voices of women were mostly omitted. In only some states was their voting permitted. But nothing could muffle equality's call. A right isn't right till it's granted to all. Suffragists, these are people who fought for the right to vote. Suffragists didn't give up on the fight, and the 19th Amendment gave women the right. But voters of color still met with oppression. Their voting was hindered by brutal suppression. So we passed legislation to make voting fair, to extend and protect voters' rights everywhere. And here we see some different acts that gave more and more people their right to vote. (1970) was the first extension of the Voters Voting Rights Act. How long ago was that? Not that long ago. We heard it, we felt it, equality's call. A right isn't right till it's granted to all. The journey's not over. The work hasn't ended. Democracy's dream must be constantly tended. But where we are now is a debt that we owe to the work of more people than we'll ever know. And each time we vote, we acknowledge that past. We honor our rights to ensure they will last. For to vote is to answer equality's call. And each time we vote with them all. This is all information about voting-related amendments and legislation. I'll quickly tell you a little bit about them. Here this says, the U.S. Constitution, ratified in 1788, is our nation's framework and fundamental law. As originally written, it did not establish voting rights. It allowed states to determine who was eligible to vote. Since then, constitutional amendments and federal laws have been passed to extend citizenship and voting rights and to protect those rights from being violated. Some key amendments and laws include the 15th Amendment in 1870 granted African American men the right to vote. The 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920, that's 100 years ago, granted women the right to vote. Women were only granted the right to vote 100 years ago. African American men were only granted the right to vote 130 years ago. In 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act granted citizenship to Native Americans. The last sentence here says Native Americans did not gain voting rights in all states until 1957. The Chinese Exclusion Repeal Act in 1943 granted citizenship to some Chinese immigrants. And in 1952, the Immigration and Nationality Act ended Asian American citizenship restrictions. The 23rd Amendment in 1961 gave residents of Washington, D.C. the right to vote for president and vice president. The 24th Amendment, ratified in 1964, outlawed the poll tax in federal elections. The poll tax Poll taxes were a fee that had to be paid prior to voting, and they restricted voting for the poor. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act outlawed discriminatory voting rules, such as literacy tests. The 26th Amendment in 1971 lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. In 1984, voting accessibility for the elderly and handicapped improved physical access to voting. And in 1993, the National Voter Registration Act required states to expand voter registration opportunities. And in 2002, the Help America Vote Act made reforms to the election system. This list is not exhaustive. Voting rights have been impacted by other federal laws, by Supreme Court decisions, and by state laws. The effort to protect voting rights is ongoing. To learn more, head over to your library. You can also visit deborahdyson.com for further reading. Here are some information about different voting right activists, and I want to highlight this question at the end. How will you answer equality's call? Do all people get to vote in the United States today? How could we improve access to voting? Is voting important? When you turn 18, do you think you'll vote? How will you answer equality's